So welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlotte. Nice to see a nice crowd here tonight. Nice crowd on Zoom. We welcome y'all. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of 6 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading So you may be aware that our Sangha, our community, held its annual residential retreat a couple of weeks ago. And it was really lovely being with members of our community for 4 days in silent meditation practice. It's quite an experience. If you didn't take advantage of that this year, we'll do it again in August of next year, so join us. The topic of our retreat was equanimity. And during the retreat, there were lots of opportunities for us to explore equanimity. We had evening Dharma talks on equanimity. We had morning instruction periods. And then there were private meeting opportunities between the participants and teachers to deal with any questions people had. And one topic that came up multiple times was, what is insight? What is an insight? How do I know when I have had an insight? Is it something I should be striving for? Should I set it as an objective? And if so, how do I go about it? So I want to talk about insight tonight. And if you were at the retreat, some of what I'm going to say will sound familiar. The topic of equanimity and the topic of insight are not the same. This talk is not the same, but they're intimately connected. So there'll be things that'll sound familiar. So we practice insight meditation. What does that really mean? I want to talk for a little bit about what insight is, and then how we might develop insight from at least 2 different angles looking at it. So one definition that seems to me pretty on point is insight is apprehending the true nature of a thing, especially through intuitive understanding. And I think that definition hits on 2 key points about insight. First, it acknowledges that to have insight is to recognize a thing's true nature. It means looking past our conditioning and our habitual views and the clouded perceptions that arise because of our wanting things to be a certain way. So Dharma teacher and scholar Andy Olinsky puts it this way: as the flip chart of mind moments rapidly unfolds, we weave all sorts of narratives about the way things are, filling in the blanks with various assumptions, projections, and aspirations. Taking these as real, we go on to seek gratification and security to a degree that is not possible to obtain. So the second key point in the definition of insight is especially through intuitive understanding. So we're not talking about academic knowledge, not intellectual reasoning. Intuitive knowing is a really different process. And we live in a culture that extols the intellectual approach to knowledge above all else. Many of us arrive at adulthood with little or no familiarity with our own intuitive capabilities because our culture doesn't nurture those. But intuition is an essential component of insight. So let me just be clear now. I'm not saying the intellectual approach doesn't have a place or it's not useful. It's essential. But what I'm saying is it should be dethroned as the one and only way, the one and only legitimate way of knowing, and intuitive knowing should be included there. So we can have insights about a lot of different things. Maybe we reflect on our upbringing, and maybe we make a connection that we've not previously made. Maybe our older brother had red hair and he liked to pick on us. And so as an adult, we notice that when we approach a red-haired person, we're always a little anxious. So when we bring this unconscious behavior into our awareness, it gives us the opportunity to discard old patterns that no longer serve us. Now, I would classify this type of awareness as an insight, and this type of insight can be valuable in our personal growth. But in the context of the Dharma, the term insight has a much more precise meaning. It refers to insight into a teaching, one of the Buddhist teachings, which is referred to as the three characteristics of existence, or the three marks of existence. So to answer the question, what is insight? First, we have to understand the three characteristics of existence. When I was putting this talk together, I got off on a long tangent explaining what the three characteristics of existence were, and then I realized the talk was twice the time I had to give it. So we can't really fully explore the three characteristics of existence tonight, but I want to just touch on them lightly. So during the time of the Buddha, the language that was spoken was the Pali language. And you don't have to learn a lot of Pali to practice insight meditation, but I want to give you the Pali words for these three characteristics. They are anicca or anicca, depending on how you pronounce it, dukkha, and anatta. And they're often translated into English as impermanence, suffering, and not self. I like the terms unreliability, impermanence, unreliability. You can use those interchangeably. Unsatisfactoriness, interchangeable with suffering, and selflessness, interchangeable with not self. But the important thing is to realize that they're referring to the same three characteristics. So here's a brief comment from Bhikkhu Bodhi. He's a Theravadan, well, he's a monk and a scholar. And here's what he says about insight and the three characteristics. He says, insight is generated by contemplating the factors of existence in terms of their three universal marks: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and selflessness. Generally, the first of these three marks to be discerned is impermanence. So that's the one that's usually most accessible to people. When impermanence is seen, insight into the other two marks closely follows. So you'll notice he didn't say one way to generate insight is by contemplating the three factors. What he said is insight is generated. So he's making a cause and effect connection. So I'll give you one more quote. There's a Buddhist monk, Nyanaponika Thera, and he wrote a book 40 years ago, The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. Might have been 60 years ago. And here's what he had to say. Insight is the direct and penetrative realization of the three characteristics of existence. That is, impermanence, suffering, and impersonality. He's using that instead of selflessness or not self. It is not a mere intellectual appreciation. or conceptual knowledge of these truths. So here he's pointing back to intuition, the experiential knowing, the different way of knowing from intellectual knowing. It is not a mere intellectual appreciation or conceptual knowledge of these truths, but an unshakable personal experience of them, obtained and matured through repeated confrontation with the facts underlying those truths. Insight belongs to that type of life-transforming knowledge, which the French thinker Guyot had in mind when he said, "If one knows but does not act accordingly, one knows imperfectly." And to me, that really points to intuitive knowing. If I know something intellectually, but I don't act in accordance with that intellectual knowing, then it really isn't deeply ingrained in me. But when I have an intuitive knowing, I naturally act in alignment with act in alignment with that intuitive knowing because they're kind of one and the same. So he concludes, it is the intrinsic nature of insight that it produces a growing detachment and an increasing freedom from craving. So I'll give you an example. This was really helpful for me in terms of an intuitive knowing about the second mark of existence, unsatisfactoriness or suffering. I wish I could remember the moment the light bulb went off for me, but I don't. But what I came to see is I get irritated when things don't go the way I want them to. I'm imagining that's not unusual. And the, let's see, how do I say this? There's a lot of arrogance in that. Somewhere underneath there, I am presuming that things will always go the way I want them to, or else why would it irritate me when they don't? And that's a sign of ignorance. That's ignorance of the truth that things will sometimes be unsatisfactory and sometimes they'll be satisfactory. And now I've gotten to where usually, not always, but usually when I see myself doing that, it genuinely makes me laugh. It tickles me to see what's happening, the way my mind's working. So these insights that we gain over time, they stick with us and they change our way that we experience the world. I no longer have to remember that. Usually it just arises naturally. So I want to look briefly at the relationship between insight and the Noble Eightfold Path. And then I want to look at kind of some practical ways that we can cultivate insight. I'll use that term. So many of you are familiar with the Noble Eightfold Path, but I'll just recite it. Not everybody's familiar with it. So there are these 8 path factors that we're encouraged to develop in our lives. And the sequencing can vary depending on the context, but for tonight, this is the sequence that I want to mention. The first 3 path factors are the ethical behavior group, and it includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Now, the word right, some people are uncomfortable with that. You can also say wise speech, or you can say skillful speech. They all kind of mean the same thing. So that's ethical behavior, our actions. Second is the mind training factors. There are 3 of those, and that's where meditation falls, because when we're meditating, we're training our minds. And those 3 are right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And then finally, the wisdom factors. That group is also referred to as the insight group. Guess what? That's where we find insight. And they are right view and right intention. And one thing that I think is really useful is to understand how these 3 groups relate to one another. So the first group, ethical behavior, the purification of our ethical behavior supports the second group, mind training. And the result is a calmer and a more concentrated mind. And if you're unsure if that's really true, just look and see for yourself. As your mind wanders during meditation, check to see how much of your mental real estate is being consumed by inner talk about your own behavior. So it may take the shape of reviewing an encounter with somebody where there was conflict. Anybody replay stuff like that after it happens? I know I do. What we'll do is we'll tell ourselves endless stories about how this was not our fault and we were in the right and they were in the wrong. Maybe we'll have fantasies that the other person will come to us and apologize for their atrocious behavior. Or maybe we'll have fantasies that this person, somebody will kind of vindicate us in front of others and say, gosh, yeah, you were right, and this person was wrong. The mind is shameless. It'll do all that. Or on the other hand, maybe we look back and we recognize that we were culpable in this conflict. And so now the mind is telling stories about regret and how bad a person we are, or maybe fantasies, how else we might have responded. There's all this stuff that gets triggered by unskillful behavior. And it goes on and on, but the mental disturbances that come about from this lack of refined ethical behavior are really disruptive to meditation. And when our behavior is impeccable, then we can abide in what the Buddha referred to as the bliss of blamelessness. We can relax and know that we are not to blame. We have behaved properly. Our minds are collected and unified, and they're more suitable for meditation practice. So that's the first group supporting the second group, ethical behavior supporting mind training. And as we make progress in the second group, mind training, as we develop our meditation practice, that supports the factors of the third group, the insight or the wisdom group. It's the nature of insight to arise from a calm, clear mind. So the more we cultivate a calm, clear mind, the more we're available to insight. So we've been looking at this from the perspective of the Noble Eightfold Path. That's really important. And it gives us kind of guideposts we can use for reference as we go through our lives on this path, trying to develop the path. But I want to talk for just a couple minutes about some specific steps we can take, kind of less big picture and more down to the moment. So here are a few suggestions. One is, when we start our practice, we are encouraged to use breath awareness. And it's an important practice, not just for beginners, but for well-accomplished meditators, but it's not the only practice. Some of you have said before, is there anything else besides watching the breath? And the answer to that question is yes, there's much more. So breath awareness serves to stabilize our mind amid the rush of thoughts in our busy lives. But once we develop some facility for calming the mind down, once we develop that skill, then we're ready to open to our experience in a different way. So Theravadan monk Ajahn Amaro puts it this way. This is 5 or 6 sentences, so stay with me. Once the mind is clearly established and firmly placed in the present moment, one lets go of focusing on the breath or the other meditation object and opens the heart to the whole flow of experience. This flow might involve hearing sounds of birds chirping, or feeling a sensation in the legs, or having a sudden memory or remembering something that's in the refrigerator to have for a snack after meditation. There are lots of different stray thoughts, ideas, or feelings through which the mind can wander. But with the development of insight meditation, rather than focusing on the content, whatever it might be, one focuses instead on the whole process of the experience. Rather than trying to figure out what kind of bird made the sound, one notices the arising and passing away of sound, or one notices a thought arising and passing away, or one notices a sensation in the body arising and passing away. And when you hear the phrase arising and passing away, that is synonymous with insight. That is, with impermanence or unreliability. That's another way of saying we're observing that that's an insight into impermanence. So one suggestion to facilitate the arising of insight is to attend to our entire experience in meditation. And if an awareness presents itself that seems to be compelling, like an insight, don't go back to the breath. Stay with that unfolding for as long as it feels like it is useful. Don't chase it down a rabbit hole. And then when it feels complete, you go back to the breath. A second suggestion is pay very careful attention to moments arising that might be insights. Since insight is intuitive, and most of us don't grow up with a well-developed intuition, we have to begin to train ourselves to the awareness of intuition. Recognize small moments of awareness that you can identify as insights and appreciate them. That'll do two things. One is it'll begin to train your sensitivity so you can identify these moments of insight more easily. And another is it'll uplift you. You'll be able to say, hey, I meditated for 30 minutes, but I did have an insight, and that sustains us. Another suggestion is reflect on the three characteristics of existence. I couldn't cover them entirely tonight, but I invite you, consider this your invitation to find material online and begin to become familiar with them. So reflect on them. Keep a copy by your meditation cushion and just read them before you meditate. Or when you find a passage that really speaks to you about them, place that beside your meditation cushion. And touch in with them during the course of the day, just for a moment. Remember those three characteristics so that it's not only once a day that you're touching it. And the final suggestion is to be patient. Insight is not like other parts of the path. It's different. We can sit down and we can say, I'm going to cultivate concentration. That's a skill we can work on. Or we can say, I'm going to work on right speech. I'm going to make a decision to do that. But it doesn't work that way with insight. We can't just say, well, now I think I'll sit down and have an insight. It's mysterious how insight arises and unfolds in its own time, not based on our wishes. Philip Moffitt likes to say that all we can do is prepare our minds, which is what we're doing with meditation, and then place ourselves outside the gate. We don't control when the gate opens, but only if we are prepared and waiting will we have access to arising insights. So I offer that for your consideration.